Welcome to this module in this course. I'm going to say it right away, this module is optional. If you already know next generation JavaScript, so things like arrow functions, let, const, and so on, you may very well skip this module. This module is for you if you know JavaScript but haven't worked with ES6 or any other version of JavaScript. Then JavaScript as we use it in this course might sometimes look like a new language to you because of all the next generation features React apps typically use. Now I'm not using these next generation features because I want to show off or anything like that. React apps typically are built with the latest version of JavaScript, and using the next gen features allows us to write clean and robust React apps. React itself uses a lot of next generation JavaScript features. Therefore, it's important for you to understand all these features and not be confused by this sometimes really strange looking version of JavaScript. JavaScript is evolving quickly, and therefore new features can look different, but really allow us as a developer to do more powerful things. This module is for you. I will walk you through the core features we use in this course so that the code thereafter hopefully looks a bit less strange to you. And again, feel free to skip this module if you already know it. Feel free to always come back to it if you later in the course encounter something that looks strange to you. Let's dive right into it with let and const. These are two keywords you're going to see a lot in this course, especially const. Let and const are different ways of creating variables. You know var. Var creates a variable in JavaScript. Now the thing is, some variables never really change. They are so-called constants. Technically though, they are all just variables because JavaScript only knows var. With ES6, a version of JavaScript, two different keywords were introduced, let and const. Var still works, but you're highly encouraged to use let and const. Let is, so to say, the new var. You use it for variable values. Let and const are also changing something behind the scenes about the scope of variables, but the most important takeaway here is use let if you want to create a variable that really is variable. Use const if you plan on creating a constant value, so something which you only assign once and never change. And that is the case more often than you might think. In this course, you will never see var, you will only see let and const, and mostly it's const. So it shouldn't confuse you, it's simply the same as var, just in a more modern way, and in the case of const, also clearly showing this is never going to receive a new value. Now, since this is always a bit clearer in practice, let's have a look at it. For this, it's best if you visit jsbin.com. That's another web editor which makes it easy for us to enter some JavaScript and see some console output. For that, disable HTML and output up there and instead enable JavaScript and console. Now on the left side you can write next generation JavaScript, on the right side you'll see the output. So there we can create a variable, my name, set it equal to max, console log my name, and if you now hit Control Enter, you'll see max on the right. Not that new to you probably. Obviously we can then set my name to menu, and if we then console log my name again, it might also not totally surprise you that if you clear and run this again, you see max from the first statement and menu from the second one. Now if you change var to let, nothing's going to change. Hitting run still works in the exact same way. If you use const though, like this, then clearing and running this will output max, but then throw an error since we try to reassign a constant variable, which is kind of a strange name. This is const, and this is the idea behind const. You can say this should never get a new value, and if you then accidentally write some code where you reassign it, you get an error and hence a chance to improve your code. You learned about let and const. Another thing, another construct you're going to see a lot in this course are arrow functions. That's a different syntax for creating JavaScript functions. A normal JavaScript function, of course, looks like this with the function keyword. You might also know the syntax where you have var myfunc equals function. Now, an arrow function looks like this. Here I'm storing it in a constant, and then on the right side of the equal sign, that's the arrow function syntax. A list of arguments, here it's none, but it could hold some arguments, and then an arrow, so an equal sign and a greater than sign, and then the function body. The arrow function syntax is a bit shorter than the normal syntax, since it omits the function keyword, and it also, and that is the great benefit, solves a lot of the issues you often had with the this keyword in JavaScript. If you've worked with JavaScript a bit, you probably know that the this keyword doesn't always refer to what you might have expected it to refer to during you writing your code. When you use this inside an arrow function, it will always keep its context and not change it surprisingly on runtime. So let's now move to JSBin to see that arrow function syntax in practice. Back in JSBin, let's create a normal function. Print my name. Like this. Now here we can of course output console log name and pass name as an argument. Now if I call print my name like this and hit Ctrl Enter, we get undefined because it didn't pass anything. If I do the same with max passed as an argument, we get max. Now the arrow function equivalent is to store this in a constant named print my name. It could also be created with let if you plan on reassigning this variable. Print my name as a constant, and now don't forget to add this arrow between the list of arguments and the function body. If you now clear and rerun this, you still see max, so here it behaves exactly in the same way. Now the this keyword thing is something you'll see throughout the course. It becomes important once you add functions to objects, of course. First of all, let me show you some alternatives to this syntax though, regarding the argument list to be precise. If you only receive one argument, as we do here, you can also use a shortcut of omitting the parentheses around it. That's only valid for exactly one argument though, not for more and not for less. Here you will still get the same result. If you had a function which receives no arguments, this is not valid syntax. You then need to pass an empty pair of parentheses, like this. If we execute this now, we also still see max, so this works. If you have more than one argument, you also need parentheses, so name and age like this won't work. You will need to wrap this in parentheses. And now you could output name and age and pass both as arguments here. So these are the different syntaxes you might see regarding the arguments. There also is an alternative regarding the function body, so on the right side of the arrow. Obviously, a lot of functions just return something. So let's say here we actually want to multiply something and we get a number as an argument. Now we want to return number times 2. Obviously, what we can do is we can console log the result of multiply, so what's returned by multiply, and pass 2 here. If I now clear this and run this, we should see 4. And we do. If you have this case where all you do in your function body is return and you have no other code in there, you can omit the curly braces and write this in one line. And then you also have to omit the return keyword. This is a very short version of writing this function. It gets a bit shorter if we take advantage of the other shortcut of removing the parentheses around the single argument. And now what this does is it still returns the result of this code here. We just omit the return keyword and we have to omit it. And we have a very concise and short way of writing a function that takes one or more arguments and returns something. So here, clearing and running this still yields 4. So this is also a syntax you might see. And the arrow function in general is something you'll see a lot. You saw the various syntaxes. You don't have to remember all of them right now. Just be aware that there are different syntaxes, and if we then use them, they'll quickly come back to your mind and you know why we use a given syntax. Another feature which next generation JavaScript offers is about writing modular code. So JavaScript code you split up over multiple files. And obviously we already can split our code over multiple files. We just have to import them in the correct order in our HTML files. And the idea behind export and import statements and so-called modules is that inside of a JavaScript file, we can import content from another file so that the JavaScript files themselves know their dependencies. It might look like this. We have one file, person.js, and there we have this constant person which stores a JavaScript object. And then this is the interesting part. We export this. The default keyword also is a special keyword, marking this as the default export of this file. And we can then import this somewhere else, and the import statement will be shown in a second. We also might have another file where we export multiple things. Here, a constant named clean, which holds a function in the end, and base data, which holds a number. In a third file, we might need to import from person.js and utility.js. So app.js requires import statements. And here are a couple of different import syntaxes you will see in this course. Person.js, as you see, uses the default keyword. The default keyword simply means if we just import something from that file, it will always be our default export. So in this case, the person constant. Therefore, in import person from person.js, we can name person whatever we want, which is why I printed it twice here. Person or PRS doesn't matter. It always refers to the thing you marked as the default with the default keyword. For utility.js, it's a bit different. There we import from two different constants, and therefore the import syntax uses the curly braces to explicitly target specific things from that file. These are so-called named exports. Because we import the stuff by its name. We import the clean constant by its name, and we import base data by its name. Because we didn't mark anything as the default. So for JavaScript to know what exactly we're pointing to, we need to give it the exact name. And the name goes between curly braces. By the way, you could also write this as one import statement with base data, comma, clean, or the other way around. So these are imports and exports. You write all of this in your JavaScript files, and we'll heavily use this throughout this course. Now, as with all these next generation JavaScript features, it won't run like this in all browsers. Not even the most modern browsers support all the features we'll use in this project. Therefore, in the next course module, I'll also show you how to quickly set up a project which in the end just compiles all these next generation JavaScript features to current gen JavaScript features, so that we as a developer can use the next generation JavaScript without us shipping code that runs nowhere. So back to the imports and exports, this is the syntax we use and you will see getting used a lot in this course. You might also see some variations because we can also write this differently. When we have a default export, you already saw that person is a name you can choose totally on your own. It doesn't matter here if you use person or PRS. If you have a named export, you actually have to use the exact name defined in the file with the export keyword. Still, what you can do, you can assign an alias, which you then again can freely choose in the file you're importing it with the as keyword. Or if you have multiple named exports in a file, you can import everything with this star special character and then assign an alias, and bundled in this case would be a JavaScript object which exposes all constants and whatever you export in the other file as properties, so that you simply have bundled.baseData, bundled.clean to access the exported things. That's up to you, and you will see me use these things throughout the course. The most common usage is the top one, import curly brace something curly brace from. We learned about imports and exports. Another core feature of next generation JavaScript are classes. If you're coming from some other programming language, you might already know classes. Classes are essentially blueprints for objects, in our case here for JavaScript objects. A class is created with the class keyword, and a class can have both properties and methods. Methods are simply functions attached to classes, where properties are variables attached to classes, you could say. We'll use both in this course, and I will obviously always explain what we're doing here when we add such a property or method. A class is instantiated like this with the new keyword. And this might of course look familiar to you if you worked a bit with JavaScript. You might know this from constructor functions. And indeed, classes are kind of a more convenient way of creating constructor functions. So you create JavaScript objects with classes as blueprints. That's the idea. And classes also support inheritance, which means you have another class which you inherit from, taking all its properties and methods and potentially adding new properties and methods. That also might look familiar to you. You might know this from prototypes. Let's have a look at classes in action then. Let's create a new class here. I'll name it person, just like this. Then you have curly braces to mark the class body. And now there we can start using properties. Now in its simplest form, a property is added by adding a constructor. That is a default function method you can add to any class, which will be executed whenever you instantiate the class. And a method is created just with the name of the method, parentheses, and then curly braces. And in there we can now set up properties with the this keyword, and we could write this name equals max, for example. We can now also add a method, print my name, and there we could simply output this name, referring to the name property we created. Now we can use this class to store an instance in a constant with new person, and then we can execute person print my name. If we now hit run, we see max. This is how easy we can use a class. Now I said that classes can also inherit. So what we can do is we can create another class, human, and there we might also add a constructor to set this gender equal to male or female, of course, if you want, by default, whatever you want. And there we could add print gender and then output console log this gender. And now if person extends, and that's a keyword again, extends human, now we inherit this property and this method, print gender, and we can use both on the person as well. So we can also call person print gender like that. However, before we run this successfully, or actually let's try it, we'll get an error that we must call the super constructor in the derived class. And that's important. If you are extending another class and you are implementing the constructor, which you don't have to, but if you are, then you have to add super, this special super method in the constructor. It's a keyword and it simply executes the parent constructor too, which you of course have to correctly initialize the parent class. So now if you hit clear and run, you see max and male. And obviously you could now go into your person class and still set gender there to female, which is not 100% correct here, but just to showcase that this works, now you see we print female, even though we're still calling print gender here, but it is extended by person. So these are classes, and classes are used by React to create its components. At least this is one of the two ways of creating components. This is how you will see me use it in this course, and it's important to understand that classes are just blueprints for JavaScript objects and are very comparable to constructor functions, where inheritance is comparable to prototypes. So in the last video we learned about classes, and we learned about properties and methods there too. Now next generation JavaScript also offers a different syntax of initializing properties and methods. And actually it is this more modern syntax I'll use in this course. So I want to show it to you here too. You already learned that properties are like variables you attach to classes and objects. Methods are like functions attached to classes and objects. And you learned about this syntax, where we set up properties in the constructor function. Now there is a more modern syntax, which spares us using this constructor function. With next generation JavaScript, as we will use it in this course, you can assign a property directly inside your class with myProperty=value. So you skip the constructor function call. Behind the scenes, this will still be transformed to use constructor functions, but you have an easier time writing this. And for methods, it's pretty similar. This is the old way I showed you in the last lecture. Now, the next generation JavaScript way is to use the syntax from the left, where you set up a property, and simply think of a method as a property which stores a function as a value. And then you end up with that. My method equals, and then an arrow function. The great advantage of this syntax is that since you use an arrow function as a property value here, you got no problems with the this keyword. And that's the exact reason why we will use this syntax here on the bottom right corner and the syntax on the bottom left corner throughout this course. Let me show you these syntaxes to you. Back to JSBin on the project we already worked on, here with the human and the person class. We can get rid of the constructor in the human class and get rid of the this keyword and just set gender equal to male. And print gender can be set equal to an arrow function where we console log this gender, still using the this keyword in here when we reach out to the property though. You may ignore that arrow for now. The same in the person. We no longer need the constructor and we no longer need to call super for that reason. Instead, what we do is we call this name without this, just name equals max and gender equal female if you want to, and print my name equals an arrow function too, like this. Now if we clear this and run this, you will get an error because it doesn't recognize the syntax. You actually need to go to the drop-down where it says JavaScript and choose ES6 Babel here. If you do this and hit clear and run, you see max and female. You still see the errors on the left, but you may ignore them. This is the syntax which is next generation JavaScript, which we will actually use in this course. We learned a lot about classes and arrow functions. Let's now turn our heads towards new operators we'll be able to use in the future of JavaScript and we already can use today in our React project. The spread and the rest operators. Actually, it's only one operator. 3 dots. And yes, this may look strange, but the operator is just 3 dots. Now, if we call it spread or rest, depends on where we use it. The spread operator is used to split up array elements or object properties. So we spread up an array or object. For example, if we have an old array and we want to add all the elements from that old array to a new array and additionally add a 1 and a 2 element, this first syntax would be what we use. 3 dots in front of old array will simply pull out all the elements and add it to the new array, which we create with the square brackets. And also, of course, then we can add more elements to it, since we just used the normal syntax with square brackets to create an array. The same for the object. We create a new object with curly braces, with the new prop, but then we also have ... old object to pull out all the properties of the old object and their values and add them as key value pairs to the new object. As a side note, if the old object also had a new property, it would be overwritten by new prop 5 here. So our own property takes precedence. This is the spread operator. Now, the rest operator is the same operator, but used differently. Here it's used to merge a list of function arguments into an array. And this shows us where we use it. We use it in a function argument list. Here's an example. Sort args receives an unlimited amount of arguments. So 1 argument, 2, 3, or whatever. With ... we only write 1 argument, args, but we may actually receive more than 1, and they will all be merged together into an array. So then we can apply array methods to our argument list or do whatever we want to do with our conveniently stored arguments. Let's have a look at both usages on JSBin then. So let's start with the spread operator. I'll create an array of numbers. So 1, 2, 3, add as many as you want. Now I want to create a new array, new numbers. And as you saw, spread is now simply used by adding 3 dots, then the old array numbers, and then potentially, you don't have to do that, new numbers, like 4. And again, that is optional. With that, if I now console log new numbers here, and I hit run, we get 1, 2, 3, 4, the old array with all its elements and the new element. And actually we don't add the old element. If we were to do that without the dots, it would be included as one element inside the new element. It really pulled out the old elements, as you can clearly see. So that's the spread operator. And you will see me use this throughout this course a couple of times on both arrays and objects to, for example, conveniently copy arrays or add properties to an object whilst safely copying that old object. Again, I will obviously also always mention why I'm using that operator when I do in the course. Just be aware that it exists. Let's now see the same for objects. I'll create a person object here where I have a name, let's say Max. And now I will have a new person object, which is a JavaScript object, a new one, where I first of all use the spread operator on person to copy all the property value pairs of the old object, and potentially, and that's also optional, add a new property. And now if I console log new person, you may ignore this error which is thrown by JSBin. The syntax will be supported in our course project. If we do this, you see object is printed here with name Max at age 28. So it's taking the old person and distributing it into the new person. That's the spread operator. Now the rest operator, which is used less often though, is used in a function. And you could of course also use a ES6 arrow function. So there we could have a filter function, whatever you want to name it. And we get a couple of args, and you don't have to use args here. You can also name this A or whatever you want, but you have to use the 3 dots in front of it. So then there, you can simply return, and we could use the inline syntax here to write it all in one line without the return keyword. Here I'll use return. You could return args, and then let's say we call the built-in filter method, which is available on arrays. And keep in mind, the dots here are used as a rest operator, and that merges the arguments into an array, so we can use array methods like filter. Filter will execute a function on every element in the passed in array. So here we would get our element, and then we could use an inline arrow function to simply say return true or false, which filter expects, if the element is equal to 1. Now that might be a lot of syntax you don't know. 3 equal signs checks for type and value equality, so that L also has to be a number. And this is just an arrow function we pass to the built-in filter method. So this has nothing to do with rest or spread. With that, we could call filter, and let's console log it to see something. Console log filter, so our filter function here, on let's say 1, 2, 3. And actually, we should only log 1 here, as an array though, because we filtered this array, which is created with the rest operator with the 3 dots here. So that's rest and spread. Again, spread is the usage of the 3 dots you'll see more often in this course. So we learned about rest and spread. There's one other next generation feature I definitely want to cover, and that's called destructuring. Destructuring allows you to easily extract array elements or object properties and store them in variables. When you first hear about that, it might sound like the exact thing the spread operator does, but actually it's a different thing. Spread takes out all elements, all properties, and distributes them in a new array or object or wherever you're using it. Destructuring allows you to pull out single elements or properties and store them in variables. For arrays, and objects. Now for arrays, it looks like this. If we have an array with two elements, hello and max, then we can use this strange looking syntax on the left side of the equal sign, which looks like we are creating an array, but we are not, to assign the variables a and b to hello and max respectively. And for object destructuring, it's the same syntax with curly braces, and where in array destructuring, the order defines which property we take. For object destructuring, it's the property name. So curly brace name curly brace on the left side targets the name property of the object on the right side and pulls out the value, which is why logging age would yield undefined. We're not pulling this out of the object here. So this is destructuring. Let's also have a look at this in practice. Back in JSBin, let's start with our numbers array again, which has the numbers 1, 2, and 3. And now let's say we want to get the numbers 1 and 2. Then we can use this array syntax on the left side of the equal sign and choose any variable names of our choice, like num1 and num2. And we assign this equal to the numbers array. If I now console log num1 and num2, and I run this, you see 1 and 2 being logged, because I'm pulling these two out of the array. I'm not pulling 3. If I wanted to get 3, by the way, I'll simply add num3 here. You don't have to rename it though. And you leave out the one space with an empty space here in your declaration on the left side. Now if you hit run, you get 1 and 3. That's array destructuring. Now, object destructuring is also supported by our project as we'll use it in this course. However, it's not supported by JSBin here, so I can't show it to you, but I did show the syntax on the slide. It's the syntax where you use the curly braces on the left and target a property with its property name. In this course, I won't use these destructuring syntaxes too often, but I want you to be aware of the existence of them and that they are nice ways of conveniently pulling out certain elements from an array or properties with their values from an object. Now, over the last lectures, I introduced you to some of the most important next generation JavaScript features which you're going to see in this course. There are two other things I now definitely also want to cover. They're not next generation JavaScript, but they are features you might have missed or forgotten, and they're super important to keep in mind. The first feature or concept of JavaScript I'm talking about is the fact that you have reference and primitive types. If I create a number like this, then this is a primitive type. That means if I create a second number, num2, and set it equal to this number, then it will actually create a real copy of number. So num2, of course, now if I log this, will also be 1, but it will have copied that value 1 into num2. Now, numbers, strings, booleans, these are so-called primitive types. Whenever you reassign or you store a variable in another variable, it will copy the value. Objects and arrays are reference types though. Let me show you what I mean. If I create my person object, which just has a name here, and I now create a second person and assign person as a value here, if I console log second person, and I hit run, it will print the same value as the first person, but it will not actually have copied the person. Instead, person, the object, is stored in memory, and in the constant person, we store a pointer to that place in memory. And if we then assign person to second person, that pointer will be copied. We can see that this is the case if we change person.name after having it copied. With that, you would expect to print Max here still, a person with name Max, because we copied person, stored it in second person, and thereafter changed the name. However, if I clear and run, you will see name menu here, even though I'm printing the second person. So for second person, the name also changed. The reason for this is that it just copied the pointer and points to the exact same object in memory as person does. So if we change name on person, we automatically change it for second person. Now that's important to keep in mind, and it's the same for arrays. If you copy, in quotation marks, an array like this, and you then change an array element, it will also change in the so-called copied array. This will become important in React because it can lead to unexpected behaviors if you copy objects or arrays like this, because you then may manipulate one object in one place in the app and accidentally manipulate another usage of the same object in another place of the app. Therefore, we will learn techniques to copy this in an immutable way, which means we copy that by really copying the object and not just the pointer. For that, we can use this spread operator. Now we can simply create a new person object here and spread the person properties. This will pull out the properties and the values of the properties from the object and add it to this newly created object here. And we do create a new one with the curly braces. Now if I hit clear and run, we still print an object with name Max, even though we changed the name to Manu here, because now we really created a real copy. This is a technique I will also come back to later in this course. It's just important to realize and to keep in mind that objects and arrays are reference types. If you reassign them, you're copying the pointer, not the value. Therefore, if you want to do this in a real copy way, you will have to create a new object and just copy the properties and not the entire object. That's something very important to keep in mind for this course. In the last lecture, we had a look at reference and primitive types, something super important to keep in mind when working with JavaScript. Another thing you will see quite a lot in this course are array functions. We already saw filter a couple of lectures ago. We also got sort, map, and so on. Let me quickly show you what I mean. The good old numbers array with 1, 2, and 3. Now let's say we want to turn this into an array where each number is doubled. So we have the double num array, something like that. We can use an array function for this. We can take the numbers array and call map. Map is a built-in array method, and there are many of these methods. I will use quite a lot of them, and they're not next generation JavaScript. All these methods work in the same way though. They take a function as an input, and this function, which is an arrow function here but could be a normal function, is then simply executed on each element in the array here. So on each element in the numbers array, on 1 and 2 and 3. So therefore, what we get in this arrow function is a number in the end, but you can name this argument whatever you want. Here we can then simply return something, and what you have to do in this internal function depends on which array function you're using. Check the docs in places like the Mozilla Developer Network docs to learn more about the available array functions. So in the map function, we have to return the new value we want to turn the old one into. So we could return num times 2. And since this is executed on every element here, it will return 2, 4, and 6. And conveniently map also returns a new array, so a real new array, which is then stored in double num array. So now if I output numbers and thereafter double num array like this, and I now hit run, you see the old one is unchanged, but the new one holds double the values. And I will explain what these functions do when we use them in the course. I just want to bring them to your attention right now, explain that they always have this function which gets executed on each element, and that they are not next generation JavaScript, but normal JavaScript actually. Be prepared to meet them. I will explain what they do when we see them, and always feel free to dive into docs like the Mozilla Developer Network to learn more about them. With that, I want to conclude this module. We learned a lot about next generation JavaScript and some important JavaScript concepts in general. You will meet a lot of the things you'll learn about in this module throughout the course. Don't be confused by it. It's still JavaScript, just using some more modern features. That's just how we write React apps. The next module will now start with React, and I will show you how to quickly create a project setup where we can use all these features whilst still shipping code that works in older browsers too. With that, you're well prepared. Always feel free to go back to this module and have a look at a given feature if you forgot how it worked and you meet it in the course and want to refresh your knowledge. And with that, let's dive into React.